The weight of old stone. On what a man builds when he finally stops climbing. Chapter 1. The Exit Package. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. I know because I looked at my watch. The good one, the Seiko I'd bought myself after my first promotion in 1994. When the HR director began speaking, and I looked at it again when she finished. 11 minutes to end 30 years. There was a folder. There was a phrase about strategic restructuring. There was a form requiring my signature acknowledging the severance terms, which were, objectively speaking, generous, and which I signed in the neat, unhurried hand of a man who had spent 3 decades signing documents and was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing his hand shake. I am David Ashworth. I am 58 years old. I was, until that Wednesday in March, the Director of European Operations for a financial services firm whose name I will not trouble you with, because it does not deserve the ink. I had given them what the exit form primly called, significant years of service, and they had given me a potted plant for my 25th anniversary, and, latterly, an 11-minute meeting with a woman half my age who could not quite meet my eyes. I took the lift down alone. I walked out through the revolving door onto Canary Wharf, where the glass towers stood in their usual self-important gleam, and I stood on the pavement in the wind off the Thames, and felt something I had not felt since I was about 7 years old and missed the bus home from school completely, absolutely stranded. I had a flat in Islington. I had savings. I had 2 grown children who lived their own full lives in Edinburgh and Melbourne respectively, and a very civil relationship with my ex-wife, who had left 8 years ago for reasons we had both been too polished to state plainly and too grown up to argue about. I had colleagues. People I'd had drinks with, competed with, respected professionally for decades. And I understood, standing on that pavement, that I had no idea which of them I would actually call. I went home. I made tea. I sat in my flat, which was very clean and very quiet, and had the particular quality of a space optimized for life rather than actually lived in, and I looked at my laptop, which contained 3 decades of spreadsheets and strategy documents and performance reviews. And I thought, I do not want to do this again. I want to say the decision to buy the farmhouse was considered and rational. It was not. It was the product of 6 weeks of insomnia, 1 too many evenings on property websites, a conversation with my son Jamie in Edinburgh, who said, carefully, kindly, knowing me well, "Dad, you've been optimizing your life for other people's approval for 30 years. Maybe do something daft." And a listing I found at 2 in the morning for a farmhouse in a village called Strathbrae, in the Scottish Highlands, described by the estate agent as a property of considerable historic character requiring significant renovation. The photographs showed a building that was, plainly, falling apart. Roof gone in one section. Windows boarded. A wall on the east side bowing outward at an angle that suggested it had been losing an argument with gravity for some time. Stone walls a foot thick, black with damp. A vegetable garden that had gone back to wilderness. A view from the front door. You could see it in one photograph, through the gap where a window used to be. Of a glen that descended to a loch, gray-green in the winter light, enormous, utterly still. I called the agent at 9 the next morning and made an offer. My daughter Hannah rang from Melbourne when she heard. "Dad," she said, in the tone she uses when she is trying very hard to be supportive, "have you ever done any renovation work?" "I once put up a shelf," I said. There was a long silence. "Okay, she said. Okay. Send photos. Chapter 2. Learning to use my hands. The farmhouse was called Tigh na Creige, which the solicitor's notes translated as House of the Rock, and which turned out to be a description rather than a name. It sat on a shelf of granite on the lower slope of a hillside above the village of Strathbrae, and the rock it was built on and built from were the same rock, grey and mica flecked and indifferent to weather in the way of things that have been here since before anyone was counting. The house itself was circa 1780. The estate agent had not mentioned that the kitchen floor was partially collapsed, or that an entire family of starlings had taken up residence in the section of roof that remained, but I discovered both of these things within my first hour of ownership, so at least the surprises were front-loaded. I moved into a caravan in the yard. I had bought the caravan on the advice of a man at the estate agent's, who said, with Highland understatement, that I might want somewhere dry to sleep while the work progresses. The caravan was small, propane heated, and had a window that looked out at the loch when the condensation allowed, which in the early weeks was rarely. I did not mind. After the Islington flat, the smallness felt honest rather than cramped. Strathbrae had, by my count, 43 permanent residents, 1 pub, 1 shop that also served as a post office, a church that held services on alternating Sundays when the minister could get over from Inverness, and the collective opinion that I was almost certainly going to give up within 3 months and go back to London. This opinion was not stated to my face. Highlanders are too courteous for that. But it was communicated with the efficient precision of a community that has been watching incomers attempt and abandon local properties for generations, and it had the quality of a settled prediction rather than a harsh judgment. The man who sold me most of what I came to know about the house was Alistair Mackay, who was 71 years old, had been a stonemason his entire working life, and who appeared at my gate one morning in May with a thermos of tea, looked at the east wall for a long time without speaking, and then said, "You'll need lime mortar, not cement. Cement'll crack it. The stone breathes, you understand. You have to let it breathe." This was the longest speech Alistair had made to me in the 3 weeks since my arrival. I received it with appropriate gravity. "Can you show me?" I said. He looked at me with the measuring expression of a man deciding whether a thing is worth his time. Then he said, "Aye," and put down his thermos, and that was how I came to spend the next 6 weeks learning to mix and apply lime mortar, under the intermittent supervision of a 71-year-old stonemason who communicated primarily through demonstration and the occasional approving grunt. The physical work was, in those first months, genuinely brutal. I had not been unfit. I'd maintained a gym membership in London with the same compulsive discipline I applied to everything. But the gym had not prepared me for 12-hour days of hauling stone, working mortar, stripping rotten timber, clearing rubble, and discovering, repeatedly, that problems I thought I'd solved had further layers underneath. My hands blistered and then calloused. My back argued loudly for the first month and then, gradually, submitted. I slept, in the caravan, with the absolute depth of a person who has genuinely exhausted their body, and I woke with a clarity I had not felt in years. I made mistakes constantly. I rebuilt one section of internal wall 3 times before the courses ran true. I ordered the wrong grade of timber for the kitchen joists and had to return it, which involved a 40-minute drive to the merchant in Inverness, and a very patient conversation with the man there who did not say, "I told you so," but whose eyes did. I attempted to repair a section of roof and created, by nightfall, a hole considerably larger than the one I had started with, at which point Alistair, who had been watching from the yard with his thermos, suggested I might want to call the roofer in Bewley. "Did you know I was going to make a mess of it?" I asked him. "Aye," he said pleasantly. "Why didn't you stop me?" He considered this. A man has to find out what he doesn't know before he'll listen about what he needs to learn. He poured tea from his thermos into the cap and handed it to me. "You're listening now." This was, I later realized, as close as Alistair ever came to a compliment. I treasured it accordingly. By August the first had a watertight roof, a sound east wall, a functional kitchen with a reclaimed range cooker that I had coaxed back to life over 2 weeks of patient mechanical work, using a manual I found online, and the advice of a woman in the village named Moira who had owned an identical model in the 80s. The floor was new flagged in reclaimed stone. The starlings had been rehomed. I'd built them a proper nest box on the barn wall, which felt like the least I could do. In the kitchen, for the first time in what I estimated was 30 years, was warm. Alistair came to inspect it. He stood in the middle of the room, looked at the flagstones, looked at the range, looked at the plastered walls. He said nothing for some time. "The courses are true," he said finally, meaning the stone. Then he accepted a cup of tea from the new kitchen and drank it standing up, looking out of the window at the loch, and I understood this was how Alistair Mackay celebrated. I was beginning to understand a great many things. Chapter 3: What the Village Taught Me. The shift happened gradually, as I suspect all real shifts do, invisibly, until one day you look back and cannot quite say when it occurred. In September I cleared the vegetable garden. 3 days' work, roots and bracken and 20 years of volunteer growth. And turned the soil and planted winter greens and garlic because the planting calendar I'd bought at the Inverness Garden Centre told me to, and because the act of pressing seeds into soil gave me a satisfaction that was entirely out of proportion to the effort, and entirely unlike anything I had felt in 30 years of spreadsheets. I am not going to make grand claims about this. It was garlic. But the garlic grew, and in the growing it did something to me that I would have found difficult to explain to the man I had been in March. In October, when the loch went pewter and the hills went russet and the light in the evenings was the color of something medieval and beautiful, I began spending time at the pub. The Stag and Heather, run by a couple named Fergus and Deirdre, who served a very serviceable stew and a local ale that improved with each visit. The pub was where Strathbray's social life concentrated itself, not loudly, but steadily, the way warmth concentrates around a good stove. People talked about the weather, the deer population, the ongoing question of whether the road to Bewley was going to be repaired before it became impassable, and the many failings of whatever government happened to be in power, on which point there was universal agreement across what I suspected was a considerable range of political opinion. I listened more than I spoke, which was new for me. In London I had chaired meetings, given presentations, held the floor by professional habit. Here no one was interested in my opinions until they had formed one about me. And forming one took time, and the time was non-negotiable. I did not find this frustrating. I found it clarifying. In London, your reputation arrived before you and left after you. Here, it was simply you, in the room, being looked at steadily by people who had known each other their whole lives, and were prepared to wait. The woman I first noticed properly, I mean, not just as a face in the village, was Ailey Grant. She was 55, a ceramicist, and she ran a studio in a converted outbuilding behind her cottage on the south side of the village, where she made functional stoneware in the colors of the glen. Grays and blue-greens and the pale ochre of winter grass. I had bought 2 of her mugs at the village show in September, because they were good mugs, and also because I had arrived at a stage in my renovation where I was thinking carefully about what I wanted in the house and had understood, without quite articulating it, that I wanted things made by hand, things that bore the trace of the person who made them. She had been polite at the show. Professionally warm, the way craftspeople are with customers they don't yet know. I had admired the glazes. She had explained the firing process with the quiet authority of expertise. I had bought the mugs and gone home. We met properly at a November ceilidh. The village held one each year in the church hall, a fundraiser for the roof fund, which appeared to be a permanent institutional feature of Scottish rural life. And I was pressed into dancing Strip the Willow by Deirdre from the pub, who was a woman of considerable social authority, and found myself partnered at one point with Ailey, who danced with the relaxed competence of someone who has been doing this since childhood. Afterward, slightly out of breath, we ended up at the same corner of the room with glasses of the local whiskey, and she said, "You're not as lost as you look." Which I thought was either the kindest, or the most ambiguous thing anyone had said to me in Strathbray. Was I looking lost? I said. At the beginning, she said. Less so now. She looked at me with the directness that I was coming to associate with people who lived without the buffer of the city. What did you do before? In London? Finance, I said. Operations management. Very important meetings about things that seemed urgent at the time. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. And now you're rebuilding an 18th century farmhouse with your own hands. Mostly with Alistair's guidance, I admitted. Alistair doesn't guide people he doesn't think are worth it, she said. He's been telling Fergus you did the east wall properly. For Alistair, that's more or less a standing ovation. I went home that night in the cold, walking the lane back to Tigh na Creige. The stars enormous in the Highland dark, and felt something I had been trying to name for months settle into place. Not happiness, exactly. Not contentment, though it was close. It was more like legibility. The sense of being a person you could actually read, rather than a function in an organizational chart. I stood at the door of the farmhouse. My farmhouse, with its sound roof and its breathing walls and its warm kitchen. And looked out at the loch, black and silver in the starlight, and I thought, I am going to be all right here. I had not been certain of that until this moment. Then I went inside and wrote a long email to my daughter Hannah, who had been worrying quietly for 9 months, and I told her so. Chapter 4. The Storm. The warning came on a Thursday in January. The kind of Highland January that reminds you the Highlands have opinions. When the Weather Service issued an amber alert for the area that Fergus at the pub upgraded immediately to going to be very bad indeed, which in his 30 years of reading Highland weather was the most reliable forecast available. By Friday morning the snow had begun. Not the tentative, decorative snow of cities, but the committed, serious snow of high ground, horizontal in places, building with a steady purpose that suggested it had somewhere to be and intended to get there. By Saturday noon the road to Bewley was gone. The power went at 2:30 in the afternoon, cleanly, without warning, in the way of things that have simply had enough. The mobile signal, which had been unreliable at the best of times, dropped to nothing an hour later. Strathbray was, for all practical purposes, on its own. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I am aware that there is a version of this story in which the incomer from London strides in and saves the day, and that version is both self-congratulatory and inaccurate. The truth is more distributed than that, and more interesting. What I had, by January, was a farmhouse with a working range cooker. Wood-fired, requiring no electricity. A wood store I had filled obsessively throughout autumn, because the Glen winters had been described to me by Alasdair with such precision that I had taken his word absolutely, and stacked 6 cords of split hardwood against the barn wall. I had a small generator I'd serviced in November. I had a gravity-fed water system from a hillside tank that worked without power. And I had, from 9 months of working with my hands in a building that had stood for 240 years, a functional understanding of how to keep a stone building warm and its occupants alive in weather that meant business. I also had, it turned out, a set of skills from my corporate life that transferred more directly than I would have predicted. 30 years of operations management is, at its core, logistics under pressure. Understanding what resources you have, who needs what the dependencies are, what fails first and what you do about it. The language is different. The stakes feel different. But the thinking is the same. I went to the pub first, because that was where people would gather. Fergus had a gas camping stove going behind the bar and was making tea with a composure that suggested he had prepared for exactly this. Deirdre was on the phone. The landline still worked, the old copper wire, which I had quietly thought was the most robust telecommunications infrastructure available, and which the village's continued possession of was something I had privately celebrated, working through a list of the village's more vulnerable residents. Old Myrie McPherson hasn't got a wood stove, just the electric panel heaters, Fergus said when I arrived. And Callum Fraser's on the East Lane, the generator there packed in last spring and he never replaced it. I looked at the list Deirdre had. 11 people who needed heat. 6 households where food was a concern. 2 where medical equipment needed power. 1 dialysis patient, 1 person on a home oxygen concentrator. The dialysis patient, I said. That's Mrs. Murray? Aye. She's not due a session until Monday, but my generator can run her equipment, I said. It's rated high enough. I'll bring it to her house. I looked at Fergus. What's your wood store like? Full enough for here. Not enough for lending out. I've got 6 cords. More than I need for a week. We can distribute to the households without heating. I turned to Deirdre. Can you coordinate? You know who needs what better than I do. I'll move the wood. I just need someone to direct me. Deirdre looked at me for a moment with the evaluating expression I was now quite familiar with from Strathbray. Then she said, Aye. Right. Let's make a list. What followed was 20 hours of work that I am fairly certain I could not have managed in March. The person I had been in March, with his blistered hands and his gym maintained but not actually useful fitness. The person I was in January could load a sledge with split hardwood and drag it through knee-deep snow to a cottage 400 yards away and do it again 6 times. Could keep a fire going in an unfamiliar grate. Could assess a failing generator by sound and identify the fault and, in one case, fix it. Could sit with old Myrie McPherson, who was 84 and frightened, and talk to her steadily and practically, until the fear subsided to a manageable level. and the kettle was on her wood stove and the room was warming. Alistair Mackay appeared at my side at some point in the early hours of Saturday night, silently, without explanation, carrying tools. We worked through the night. Him, me, and young Robbie Fraser, who was 22 and strong as a hill pony. Moving wood and checking pipes and making sure nobody was dangerously cold. At 4 in the morning we stopped at my farmhouse, because it was the warmest place we'd passed, and drank tea from Ailey's mugs, the grey-green ones. And Alistair said nothing for a long time, and then said, "You know what you're doing." This was, I understood, the full version of the standing ovation. Ailey had spent the storm at her studio, which had its own wood stove, and had by Sunday morning become the village's food distribution center. She had a large store of preserved and dried goods, and the instinct, apparently innate, to start cooking for as many people as needed feeding. When I arrived at her door on Sunday morning with Alistair and Robbie, she had soup going in a pot big enough to house a small family, and was making bread with the focused calm of someone who bakes as a form of thinking. "Sit down," she said, without looking up. "All of you. You look terrible." We sat. The soup was the best thing I had eaten in my life, which is a sentence I apply carefully and mean completely. Alistair ate 2 bowls without speaking. Robbie ate 3. I ate 2 and then a large piece of bread and felt something close to tearful, which I attributed entirely to exhaustion, and not at all to the fact that I was sitting in a warm room, having done something genuinely useful, among people I had come to care about, and that this was, in a way I had not experienced in 30 years, exactly where I was supposed to be. The power came back on Monday afternoon. The road to Bewley was cleared by Tuesday. The storm, which had made the regional news and prompted a welfare call from the local council, was declared officially over. Strathspey went back to its ordinary rhythms, which are not dramatic but are deeply themselves. And I went back to Tigh na Creige and spent 3 days sleeping and finishing the bathroom floor. Chapter 5. What Tigh na Creige became. Spring came to Strathspey the way it always does in the Highlands. Late, undramatic, announced not by warmth but by light. A gradual extension of the evenings, the loch going from pewter to a hesitant blue, the hillside producing small green things in the places where the deer hadn't been. I had been here for a year. The house was not finished. I want to be honest about that. Houses like Tigh na Creige are not the kind of project you complete. They are the kind you manage in an ongoing relationship, which changes you as much as you change them. The kitchen was done, and the sitting room, and the bedroom, and the bathroom. The east wing, 2 more rooms, the larger of which I had begun to think of as a study, was structurally sound but unplastered. The barn needed a new roof and I was saving for it. The vegetable garden was producing reliably. I had added 3 raised beds in February and planted early potatoes. Because Alistair had told me the ground warmed sooner on the south-facing slope. And because I had stopped being the sort of man who needed to understand the science before he trusted the instruction. The village had changed around me, or I had changed within it, or both. The two being largely inseparable. I had a place at the pub that was mine by habit now, a stool at the corner of the bar where Fergus kept a pint ready for me when I came in on a Friday, which is a small thing and a large thing simultaneously. I helped Alistair with a restoration job in Bewley in February, because he needed a second pair of competent hands and had, with characteristic spareness, indicated that he thought mine were now adequate. I ran a sort of informal emergency preparedness meeting in March that had been Deirdre's idea. She had approached me with the quiet authority of a woman who sees clearly and acts on what she sees, to make sure the village was better organized before next winter. 11 people came. We made a list, designated responsibilities, checked every generator in the village, and Moira, who knew everyone's medical requirements in the way of someone who had been the unofficial community anchor for 40 years, produced a proper needs assessment that we sent to the council. It was not glamorous. It was exactly what I had spent my career doing. Identifying resources, mapping dependencies, building systems that worked under pressure. Applied to 43 people in a Highland glen rather than a corporation in Canary Wharf. The difference was that here the stakes felt real, and the people in the room were people I knew, and the feeling at the end, when we had a functioning plan rather than a vague intention, was something I had almost forgotten you could feel at work. Ailey and I had been having dinner together on Wednesday evenings since February, alternating between her cottage and my kitchen. This had begun without discussion, in the way of things that are simply logical. We had both been at the pub on a Wednesday when a conversation about her new glaze technique ran long, and Fergus had suggested we take it elsewhere as he wanted to close. And had continued without needing to be named, because we were both old enough to understand that some things are better assembled than announced. She was easy company, in the way of someone who has no performance left in her, who has arrived at herself fully, and is simply that person without apology or pretense. She talked about her work. The chemistry of glazes, the unpredictability of high-fire kilns, the way the same clay responds differently in different seasons. With the infectious enthusiasm of someone whose work is genuinely their inner life, and I listened with a quality of attention I had not given anything in years. She asked about the house, about London, about my children, about what I missed and what I didn't, with the direct curiosity of someone who finds people interesting rather than useful, and I answered honestly, which was also new. "Do you miss it?" she asked one evening in April, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, the lock going orange-pink in the window behind her. The job. The city. I thought about it properly before answering, which she had somehow given me the habit of. "I miss feeling competent," I said finally. The first 6 months here I felt incompetent every day, and it was humbling. More than I expected. And now? Now I feel competent in different ways. I looked at the flagstone floor, the plastered walls, the range that was ticking and warm. Ways that feel more solid, somehow. Less contingent. Less contingent on other people's assessment of you, she said, which was more precise than what I'd managed, and I nodded. The job valued me up until the moment it didn't, I said. Here, whether I'm valued or not is tied to what I've actually done. Alistair doesn't tell me I've done good work because it manages my performance review. He tells me because it's true, and only because it's true, and so when he says it, it means something. She smiled. You've become quite Highland about it. Is that a compliment? Here? Absolutely. In May, my son Jamie came to visit. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, looked at the house for a long time, walked around it twice, and then stood at the front door looking out at the glen the way I had stood on the first day. Taking the measure of the view, the stone, the extraordinary quietness. Then he turned and said, "Dad, this is genuinely incredible," in a voice that had nothing diplomatic in it at all, and I felt the particular pride that is not about impressing someone, but about having done something real and having someone you love recognize it. I introduced him to Alistair, who shook his hand and said, "Your father can build a wall." Which Jamie later told me was the most surreal sentence he had ever heard and which he intended to have framed. I introduced him to Fergus and Deirdre at the pub, and to Robbie Fraser, who had taken to stopping by on weekends sometimes to help with whatever I was working on, for reasons neither of us had explicitly discussed, but which I understood as the particular friendship that forms between two people working side by side on something that matters. I introduced him to Ailey, who served us both supper at her kitchen table on the Saturday evening, and afterward, walking back to the farmhouse under the extraordinary Highland stars, Jamie said simply, "She's good, Dad." "She's really good." And I said yes, she was. We did not make declarations, Ailey and I. We were too old for declarations, too sensible, too aware of how much life there was still in both of us, and how little it needed the ceremony of announcement. What we had was more interesting than that. Two people who had each assembled themselves carefully from their own materials, who had each arrived at a point where they knew what they valued and were prepared to be quietly patient about finding it, recognizing in each other something reliable, something worth making room for. On a Saturday in June. The longest light, the loch going silver blue at 10 in the evening, the hill behind the house blooming purple with early heather. I finished the sitting room. Last coat of lime wash on the walls. Shelves fitted. The two armchairs I'd found in a reclamation yard in Inverness, reupholstered by a woman in Bewley who had done them in a green wool that matched the glen, placed either side of the hearth. On the mantelpiece, the Seiko watch, my son's photograph, a small bull Ailey had made me in the grey-green glaze. A perfect thing, useful and beautiful, made by hand, bearing the trace of its maker. I stood in the doorway of that room, in the long evening light, and thought about the man who had walked out of a glass tower in Canary Wharf 14 months ago, and stood on a pavement feeling stranded. What I wanted to tell him was this. The stranding was the beginning of something. The thing you think is the end of your story, is the place where the actual story starts, if you let it. But he wouldn't have listened. He wasn't ready. And perhaps that's right. Perhaps you can only hear that when you've built it with your own hands, from the ground, with lime mortar that breathes and stone that has been here longer than anyone's worries, in a place that asked you to become someone you could actually live with. I put the kettle on. I had a woman coming for supper, and the potatoes were almost ready to lift, and tomorrow Alasdair was coming at 8 to look at the barn roof, and tell me what I'd need for it. And the list was long and the light was beautiful. And I was, against all reasonable expectation, exactly where I was supposed to be.